Andrew, thank you very much for doing this. I'd like to really focus on one of your areas of research, which I at least consider really path-breaking, and that is the intersection of technology and financial markets. And I think a good place to start might be some historical perspective of how technology has actually influenced financial markets. And maybe we could divide this pre 1990s and then since the 1990s. And I wonder if you could just give us a little bit of overview of how to think about this.
Sure. Well, technology, I think, has always influenced financial markets. We're always looking for better, faster, cheaper ways of transacting in the financial industry. A good example of this is the telegraph. In the early 1800s, before the invention of the telegraph, Wall Street was a relatively, quiet, kind of a straightforward capital market that interacted with participants who happened to be on the exchange at the time. But shortly after the invention of the telegraph, one of the photographs of Wall Street shows the skyline completely covered in telegraph wires. There was hundreds of wires that darkened the skies because now people found that they could actually trade that much more quickly. So with every single invention, we seem to be able to take those ideas and apply them to being able to make better, faster, cheaper financial transactions. And I think what we've seen over the last couple of decades is an intensification of that kind of a speed of technological advance.
So let's talk about the last 20 years. And if you could just describe the kind of technology that has arisen and how it is fueling markets, to give us some sense of the magnitude here and the speed.
Well, there's been a number of technological advances, largely having to do with telecommunications and computing. Moore's law has had an indelible impact on the financial system because we can now process many, many more transactions at a given moment. And we can also engage in lots of much more complicated kinds of trading strategies thanks to computer algorithms. So I would say algorithmic trading, the ability to encode very specific decisions and rules, investment rules in software, and the ability to execute those rules through telecommunications networks. Those two broad groups of innovations have really made the speed of financial transacting far quicker and has really dramatically increased the scale and the scope of transactions so that now what one person used to be able to do over the course of a 6.5 hour trading day, now they can do probably 100 people's jobs just by using these kinds of automated platforms.
And the impact of this speed and magnitude, would you say that does it fundamentally change the nature of what markets are? Or let me put it another way. What is the actual implication here in terms of the character of markets?
Well, it changes markets into technological haves and have-nots. That's the one big impact. It means that there's now a financial arms race of technology to see who can trade faster and who can trade, in a more subtle and sophisticated way. A simple example of this is the traditional stop-loss policy. It used to be the case that if you wanted to protect your portfolio, you would put in an order with your broker that said, if the stock price goes down below $100 a share, I want you to sell. Well, nowadays, we can actually have a whole host of much more complicated orders that say, if the stock price goes down by 100, but the S&P is above 15,000 and the VIX is down to 11.5, then trade half as much than as I would have otherwise traded if they weren't the case. So you've got these complicated algorithms that allow individuals and institutions to be able to be much more sophisticated and subtle about how they trade. And what that means is that if you don't have those tools, you're on the outside. You will not be able to take advantage of a lot of these advances.
So let's. I know this is a very difficult kind of estimation, but are the haves the tip of an iceberg, or would you say that given access to technology today, actually the haves are a much larger part of the market than we realize.
Well, so it's more like a pyramid. I would say that a lot of us individual investors are no doubt better off for this technology. If you've got a brokerage account on E-Trade or Schwab or Vanguard, you can now trade much more cheaply than you were able to even 10 years ago. You can engage in much more complicated kinds of strategies than you would otherwise. But at the very at the very tip of that pyramid are a very small number of individuals that have exceedingly advanced and very expensive technology that gives them an advantage. The most recent being, of course, the high-frequency traders that's been described in Michael Lewis's recent book.
And how about from the standpoint of let's look at a big firm, a big global financial firm. Does this technology make it harder or easier to run, to supervise? How? Let me put it this way: to what extent is the mind of a CEO able to encompass all the complexities that you're talking about?
Well, that's a really wonderful question, and I'm not sure it has a simple answer, but let me try to answer it in two different ways. So, from one perspective, technology, I think, is a means for us to control much, much more of our environment with the limited human cognitive abilities that we have. So a good example is the iPhone. The iPhone is the modern Swiss Army knife. It can do everything that we want it to do if we find the right app. And the reason that it's so effective is because it's not hard to use. It's actually quite simple to use. But that simplicity underlies incredibly complex technology. So in other words, the technology is complicated precisely so that it can be easy for us to use, so that it's simple for humans to be able to interact with it. Imagine the old days where you had to program in assembler language. In other words, if you had to program in order to speak to computers in the computer's native language, that would be very hard for us to do. So in that sense, technology today does allow a CEO to have access to much more information and much more control than ever before. However, and this is an important qualification, however, CEOs have to be attuned to that kind of technological prowess. And there's a generational gap in the sense that just like my 17-year-old, 18-year-old son is looking to use apps in a way that I never imagined could be possible. At the same time, if we talk about a CEO in his 50s or 60s not being as familiar with these kind of technological tools, they may be at a disadvantage. So I think that it's a two-edged sword. Technology is an incredibly powerful mechanism for controlling the environment and the business activities that we engage in. But at the same time, we have to be able to wield that kind of power in an effective manner.
Now, that's really sort of from the very practical management standpoint. Let's just go to theory for a second. One of the theories that scholars like yourself use is efficient markets theory. Mm-hmm. How do you link technology to that? Because ultimately, as I've learned from reading your papers, it's human beings that are managing this technology, so give us your take on how a theoretical framework for thinking about technology and markets in today and tomorrow.
Well, there's been a lot of economic research on technological innovation. And in reading that research, I was a bit dissatisfied because it didn't really explain why it is that in technological innovations, we seem to be going 2 steps forward and 1 step back, particularly in the financial industry, as we've seen over the last decade. And so it finally occurred to me that technology is a human innovation. It's a human approach to dealing with an otherwise hostile environment. So it's the way that we have evolved to adapt to that environment. And because it is a human adaptation, it means that it's going to be wielded by humans in human fashion, meaning that we're going to make mistakes. We're going to be developing technology, and those technologies will have unintended consequences. So the adaptive markets hypothesis is my rendition of how to reconcile the traditional classical theory of efficient markets, rational expectations, with the fact that humans are also individuals that have emotion, fear, and greed, and in many cases do act irrationally. And the idea is really that we adapt to a changing environment, and over the course of multiple generations, multiple innovations and failures, we learn and we improve on the technologies that we develop. So we've developed technology version 1.1, 1.2, and eventually we get to 2.0. And until we make those kinds of improvements, we are going to be dealing with the kind of challenges that these innovations ultimately will have.
So let's talk about that in terms of regulation. First of all, let me ask you, there's been a huge spate of regulation since the financial crisis, both in the U.S. and around the world. Reading between the lines, I have the feeling that you are implying that the technology and financial markets are moving much faster than the regulatory apparatus. And the reason I say that is because the regulation development, in my eyes, is very incremental. That when you actually look at what's being done, it is not a real sea change from what existed. There's some tightening up, there's some filling the gaps, there's some more supervision. First of all, would you agree with that? Would you agree that there is kind of a disconnect between the kind of markets you're talking about, massive algorithmic trading on the one hand, and let's call it Regulation 1.0 on the other?
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely a big gap. And I think that gap comes from the fact that regulators are effectively dealing with a very complex system. They don't have all of the tools needed to deal with them. And policymakers are not necessarily equipped to be able to make the kind of judgments, and they're not equipped to make the judgments in the time frame that's necessary to deal with these financial innovations. So as it is, regulators are always in the process of playing catch up. The problem is that financial innovation has actually increased in its speed over the course of the last couple of decades.
Okay, so this leads us to some of the ideas that you have been put forth that's called Regulation 2.0. Tell us give us the overview, and then maybe give us some very specific elements of this new regulatory framework that you have been thinking about.
Yeah, well, really, it came out of the fact that the Dodd-Frank Act, that really is the biggest piece of legislation in our lifetimes involving financial reform. That act is 2,319 pages long. And I don't think any of us really understands what its implications are, because much of it has yet to be implemented. And it occurred to me that we've had a great deal of effort in trying to craft this regulation reform without an understanding of where it's broken. We need to understand not just all of the various different new forms of regulation that we might impose, but rather what is likely to happen in the future to get around those new regulations. We need to start thinking about regulation as a kind of an organic, evolving entity, where regulators are going to be engaged in action, and then those who are regulated are going to be trying to innovate around them. And at some point, we're going to have to become more sophisticated about that cat and mouse game. Instead of simply assuming that regulators are going to be 2 or 3 steps behind, it would be nice to figure out a way for the regulations themselves to adapt to changing market conditions. Now, I think that regulators recognize that they're being outgunned and outpaced by financial innovation, and they're doing their best to try to deal with these issues. But ultimately, I think the legislators have to come up with smarter regulation to be able to deal with it. And that's really what's behind this Financial Regulation 2.0 effort.
Before we get to the specifics, let me ask you this. I've been talking to Andrew Haldane at the Bank of England. So he calls the financial system, he calls it a complex adaptive network. And I think there's some of that in your writings as well. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So are you saying that the regulatory system ought to be the same? That is, it has to be adaptive. It has to be kind of a similar sort of system rather than static against something that is very adaptive.
Exactly, that we have to start thinking about regulators and the regulatory framework in a much more sophisticated way. We need to re-engineer the regulatory framework so that it can keep up with the financial framework that it's trying to regulate.
Okay, so give us a few elements of what would that framework look like? Can you give us an example or two of something that you think would be appropriate, for what the financial system is becoming, and exactly how it would work?
Sure. Well, there are many pieces to it, and obviously, no one person, including me, is going to be smart enough to work out all of those pieces.
Right.
But I can certainly give you a flavor of the things that my colleagues and I are working on, and ultimately, it's going to be a very large team effort to recraft this kind of a regulatory framework. The basic idea is that in various aspects of the regulatory mandate, what we're trying to accomplish in general is a broader goal. And yet, when we design our regulations, we're focusing on very, very specific rules and regulations that sometimes don't really accomplish those goals. They really only deal with certain symptoms. A good example is capital requirements or leverage constraints. The federal code is rife with all sorts of little rules here and there that control how much capital we must have, how much leverage we could possibly take on, how much trade credit we can extend. All of these rules are actually designed to achieve one purpose. And the purpose is to instill some sense of trust and confidence in the counterparties interacting in the financial system. So the reason that we require banks to keep 7% of their capital in their vaults is because we want banks to be trusted, and we want people to engage in business with banks without worrying that they can get their money out. If what we care about is having that trust and confidence in these financial institutions, then we ought to regulate with that objective in mind and then allow the rules to adapt in order to achieve it. So a case in point is, instead of imposing a fixed leverage limit, in the case of broker accounts for individual investors that are buying securities on margin, Regulation T says that you are allowed to have 2-to-1 leverage. For every $100 of capital, you can buy $200 worth of securities. Well, that number, 2-to-1, that's been fixed by the Fed since the 1970s, and it hasn't changed at all. You can imagine a situation, though, where 2-to-1 is really not appropriate. Maybe it should be only 1-to-1. Maybe you should not have any leverage, particularly in cases where the markets are very volatile, very risky, and where there's too much credit going around. At the other extreme, when market conditions are quite calm and when there's not much volatility, you might think that 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 would be appropriate. So an example of an adaptive regulation is regulation that is designed to achieve a particular purpose, maintaining the trust and confidence of individuals in the financial marketplace. And that principle is then implemented with adaptive rules that say, we want the leverage to be no more than this amount when market conditions are risky, and we want it to be no more than that amount when market conditions are relatively benign. You can see that it's more complex. It's a more complex adaptive system, but it's a complex adaptive system that's meant to counterbalance the complex adaptive network that is the financial market.
So what that says to me is you're removing a lot. You're removing human supervision against the static rule with technology itself, because you would need some kind of algorithm that moves very smoothly depending on the economic conditions in the example you cited, right?
That's right. That's right. You're using technology to your advantage to create a new regulatory framework to be able to match that of the financial industry.
But the layers of regulators and supervisors would, I'm exaggerating this, but would be replaced in a sense by people who can actually program the relationships between, in the example you cited, the leverage requirements and the broader financial conditions.
Well, instead of the word replace, I guess I would choose the word augment.
Okay.
And that's not just a semantic difference. The idea is that humans now are no longer able to keep up with all of the various innovations that are going on in financial markets at any given point in time. But if you were able to use technology to leverage an individual's ability to be able to manage much larger numbers of entities, you could actually get better regulation. So it's really using technology in the same way that the private sector has to apply it to public sector mandates.
So that was a great example. Can you give one more example of of Regulation 2.0?
Sure. So another area where regulators have struggled with is in getting data to be able to deal with the issues that they're trying to grapple with. The fact is that we don't know a lot about the shadow banking sector. And part of the reason, of course, is that we've decided that parts of the financial industry shouldn't be under the same regulation as, say, the banking industry that deals with a lot of retail customers. So I'm not arguing that that's a bad thing. I think it's great that we have parts of the financial system that are able to innovate more freely. However, as regulators, I think that we need to understand the totality of the financial activities going on. We may not be able to control all of it, but we at least should see all of it. And the question is, how do we get the shadow banking system to provide that information without jeopardizing the economic value of the intellectual property? You know, after all, we don't ask Coca-Cola to reveal its formula. We respect its right to trade secrecy. How do we deal with the financial system where we really need to have the information, but we don't want to require that they disclose their trading strategies or their algorithms? Well, it turns out that over the course of the last couple of decades, computer scientists have actually made tremendous breakthroughs in cryptography. And one of the breakthroughs in that area is allowing individuals to share certain information without disclosing all their information. So using cryptographic methods, we can actually allow financial institutions to encrypt their data, their private algorithms and customer information, and provide regulators with this kind of encryption, and then allow the regulators to combine the data to calculate aggregate exposures of systemic risk, for example, without ever having to disclose individual data. It's a way of sharing only part of the data that you're willing to share without having to bear all. And I think that's an example where using these new algorithms, we can actually get better regulation because we don't have to compromise total transparency versus total secrecy. There is a happy medium that we can actually achieve using these technological advances.
That's fascinating. So let's make an assumption, just for the sake of this discussion, let's make an assumption that it's several years from now, the markets, the technology in the markets continues to develop very, very rapidly. There's a real innovation in regulation, and so we have regulators actually using technology in the way that the private sector does. So I'm not saying it's going to be perfect, but you know, it's a stronger regulatory system. So we've got really a much higher level of technology across the board. I want to ask you what you think the implications would be for a variety of different situations. So the first question would be, would this kind of financial system, or how should we think about this kind of financial system when it comes to the need for long-term investment, let's say, in infrastructure? Is it more or less conducive, or in a sense, is there no connection?
Oh, there's definitely a connection. I think that it's actually going to be more conducive. And the reason is that right now, our financial system and the regulatory infrastructure that goes with it is really busting at the seams. We're really straining here. And the reason we're straining is because over the last 100 years, this planet has gotten a lot bigger, a lot more crowded, a lot more complicated. In 1900, the population of this planet was 1.5 billion, and now we're at about 7 billion. If If you think about that number, it's astonishing because it means that we now have more than 4 times the number of people that are born without a job, without a home, without a savings account, without any financial sophistication whatsoever, all of which has to be developed over his or her lifetime, which means that now you've got a lot more people transacting and engaging in financial transactions over the course of their lives, and they're living longer. No wonder the financial system is a much more complicated animal than it was just a few decades ago. Right now, we don't have the wherewithal to grow that system much larger unless we actually make some significant changes to make our regulatory framework more robust. Once we have a more robust framework, then all sorts of things are possible. So for example, long-term infrastructure type investments, they require a certain discipline, meaning you got to have investors that have patience, that are willing to invest in the long run. Well, the only way that you're willing to invest in the long run is if you think you can get a decent rate of return over that long run. We all think about investing in retirement funds, but we're a bit nervous about that because, well, frankly, we're not sure that the financial institutions that we put money in are going to be around 35, 50 years from now. Imagine if you could resolve that kind of uncertainty with a better regulatory framework, so you know that if you put money in today, your grandchildren will actually benefit from that, 50 years from now. If that's the case, then all of a sudden, long-run investment projects become much more viable than they are today. So I think that really there's a very important connection between regulatory infrastructure and the ability to invest in some of society's biggest challenges.
So I imagine that you would have the same answer if I asked, the question were investments in that really benefit society in addition to infrastructure. For example, you've written in a most interesting way about mega fund for development of drugs for diseases that are not really mainstream. So these sort of society enhancing investments, would you make the same case that a more robust financial system would basically open up many more opportunities for that?
Absolutely. I think part of the challenge that we have in designing investment products is being able to communicate to investors the kinds of risks and rewards that are involved in those investments. I've been involved in various kinds of research as well as commercial endeavors for quite some time now in the financial system. And one of the things that I think has never changed is that if you can communicate effectively the opportunity of a particular investment, you will find investors willing to put their money at risk. But the key is being able to communicate that kind of risk-reward profile effectively. And having the right regulatory infrastructure to support that type of communication is really what we're talking about here. For societal challenges like take Alzheimer's disease, it's very difficult for us to get the private sector to be fully behind it in the size that it needs to be. In a recent paper that I've been working on with some colleagues that'll be published soon, we found that for developing an Alzheimer's drug, you probably need on the order of $100 billion of one large fund that can take on 100 or 200 different Alzheimer's drug development projects. The problem is that even if you could come up with $100 billion, right now there's no ability to do that because we actually haven't invested in the basic research to develop those kinds of ideas to the point where the private sector can take over. I think this is where better communication for developing these kinds of projects, a better understanding of the return to basic research could actually be a game changer. And I think over the course of the next 5 or 10 years, I'm hoping that we're going to develop that kind of discipline to be able to make the case to investors that they ought to invest in these kinds of very risky, very long-term, but ultimately very beneficial kinds of projects.
But you're tying that right to a robust regulatory system that gives people much more confidence that the financial system really will be able to work and provide decent returns.
That's right. Just in the same way that we need to have the rule of law before we can have active and reliable commerce, we've got to have the rule of a robust, stable regulatory framework that everybody understands, everybody knows how to operate within, to be able to get that infrastructure to do what it needs to do, which is to grow the economy.
So here's my final question, and it's in the same vein. It has to do with the prospects for financial crises. Um, Everything that you're saying is basically quite optimistic about the role that technology plays. I mean, obviously you acknowledge the problems, but I take from this discussion that, on balance, you feel that the more sophisticated technology that is arising, together with a robust regulatory system, is basically where the benefits far exceed the costs. But when it comes to financial crises, in the real world, let me throw something out just for you to shoot at. Nothing proceeds so smoothly, and that is that there are there are step functions, there are gaps, with the markets moving so fast, and the likelihood that even under the best circumstances, regulators will never be right up to the mark. Are you saying, Ewan, that we could enter an era where big financial crises are far less frequent than what we have experienced over the last couple of decades? In other words, do you see this combination of a technology-fueled algorithmic trading system balanced by more robust regulation as actually putting us in new terrain historically when it comes to crises, or in a sense, is that a whole different issue?
Well, I think that there are some important benefits that technology can provide for dealing with crisis. I don't believe it's possible to eliminate financial crises altogether. I think that when you take human behavior and you marry that with free enterprise, you're going to have crises from time to time. I think that's a law of nature. But in the same way that you can't legislate away hurricanes or tsunamis, but what you can do is you can prepare for them. So I think that what I'm suggesting is that with better regulatory framework, we may not be able to eliminate crises, but we can at least deal with them more effectively. And really dealing with them has to do with dealing with loss, particularly for those individuals who actually can't afford to lose. Obviously, financial markets go up and down, people lose money all the time. But crisis occurs when the wrong people lose money. And by the wrong people, I mean those who literally cannot afford to lose it. So when a hedge fund goes under, nobody talks about a government bailout. When a stock market crash happens, we study it, but there's no government bailout. But when a money market fund goes under, that's a different story, because investors in those funds are not expecting to lose principal. That's not what you expect when you put your money in a money market fund. So I think that a better regulatory infrastructure would allow us to prepare for the inevitable crises that will occur, and those who are least able to afford to deal with that won't have to. And if that's the case, then I think the role for government bailout becomes much less, and the opportunity for the economy to heal itself throughout these processes becomes a lot more likely.
Andrew, thank you very much. It was a most enlightening discussion on a really, really critical topic. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.